The cold Atlantic wind whipped across Christine Ramos's face as she pressed herself against the ship's rail, watching the pirate Captain George Jones approach with measured steps. His weathered hands gripped the wheel as he spoke words that would change everything. "You said you'd sleep on deck for work, but you'll sleep next to me in my cabin where you'll be safe." The storm clouds gathered overhead, mirroring the tempest in her heart as she realized this moment would determine not just her survival, but her very soul. The journey to this precipice had begun 3 months earlier, when Christine stood on the docks of Portsmouth with nothing but the clothes on her back and desperation carved into her bones. Her father's debts had consumed their family's modest shipping business, leaving her orphaned and penniless at 22. The creditors had taken everything, even the small cottage where she'd grown up, listening to her father's tales of merchant voyages and distant shores. "I need work," she had said to every ship captain, every merchant, every dock worker who would listen. "I'll do anything. I can read, write, keep accounts. I've helped run a shipping business since I was 14. But the responses were always the same. Polite refusals from the gentlemen, crude suggestions from the rougher men, and pitying looks from everyone else. A woman alone seeking passage and employment on merchant vessels was an impossibility in their world. The sun was setting on her 5th day at the docks when she spotted the Crimson Tide anchored at the far end of the harbor. Unlike the pristine merchant vessels, this ship bore the scars of countless battles. Its black sails were patched but sturdy, its hull scarred but seaworthy. She'd heard whispers about its captain, George Jones, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the Caribbean. Christine approached the gangplank where a burly sailor stood guard. "I need to speak with your captain," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man laughed, revealing several missing teeth. "Captain don't take visitors, especially not fancy ladies looking for charity." "I'm not looking for charity, I'm looking for work. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The sailor's expression shifted from amusement to curiosity. "Work? What kind of work you think you can do on a ship like this?" "I can navigate, keep books, read charts. I've been around ships my entire life." Christine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I'll sleep on deck if needed. Just give me work." Something in her tone must have convinced him because he gestured toward the ship. "Captain's in his cabin, but don't say I didn't warn you when he tosses you overboard." The Crimson Tide's deck was a study in organized chaos. Ropes coiled with military precision, cannons secured but ready for action, and crew members who moved with the fluid efficiency of men who'd learned to work together or die. Christine made her way to the captain's cabin, her heart pounding with each step. George Jones was studying charts when she entered, his dark hair streaked with premature silver, his hands bearing the calluses of a man who'd worked every position on a ship before commanding one. He looked up as she approached, his green eyes assessing her with the same intensity he might use to evaluate a potential storm. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he said without preamble. "Which is it?" "Desperate," Christine replied honestly. "My father owned Ramos Shipping. When he died, the debts consumed everything. I need passage to the Caribbean and work to earn it." George leaned back in his chair, studying her face as if reading a map of her intentions. "You know what kind of ship this is? I know you're not bound by the same rules as merchant vessels. I know you take what you need to survive. And I know you're my only option." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the creaking of the ship and the distant calls of seabirds. Finally, George spoke. "I don't take passengers. Everyone on this ship earns their place. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to earn my place." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the harbor. "The Caribbean isn't Portsmouth, Miss Ramos. It's a place where weakness gets you killed and trust is earned with blood. If you come aboard my ship, you follow my orders without question. You work harder than you've ever worked in your life. And you never, ever put my crew in danger with foolish decisions or feminine hysterics." Christine felt a flash of anger at his assumptions, but forced herself to remain calm. "I understand." "Do you?" George turned back to face her. "Because once we leave this harbor, there's no changing your mind. No going home when things get difficult. You'll be part of this crew until I decide otherwise. I have no home to return to, Christine said simply. This is my only choice. George studied her for another long moment, then nodded. Very well. You'll start in the galley, help with navigation when needed, and assist our quartermaster with inventory. You'll earn a half share of any prizes we take, and you'll follow the ship's articles without exception. Relief flooded through Christine like warm sunlight. Thank you, Captain. Don't thank me yet, George replied grimly. You haven't seen what this life demands. The first weeks aboard the Crimson Tide tested every assumption Christine had made about her own strength and resilience. The work was backbreaking, the conditions harsh, and the crew initially treated her with a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed hostility. She slept in a hammock strung in a corner of the lower deck. Her few possessions secured in a small sea chest that had belonged to a crew member who died in their last engagement. The ship's cook, Eric Long, was a grizzled man in his 50s who'd lost his left arm in a battle years earlier, but could still prepare meals for 30 men using only his right hand and an impressive array of improvised tools. He worked Christine harder than any servant, demanding she master not just cooking, but food preservation, inventory management, and the delicate art of making fresh water last on long voyages. Cooking on land is child's play, Eric told her as the ship rolled through heavy swells, sending pots sliding across the galley despite their securing ropes. Cooking at sea when you're being shot at by naval vessels while trying not to poison the crew with spoiled meat, that's when you earn your place. Christine learned to brace herself against the ship's movement while stirring massive pots of stew, to identify the subtle signs of spoilage in salt pork and hardtack, and to stretch meager supplies into meals that would keep the crew's strength up during long pursuits or extended battles. Her hands, once soft from her privileged life as a merchant's daughter, became calloused and scarred from handling rough rope, hot metal, and sharp knives. But it was her work with the ship's quartermaster, Scott Turner, that truly proved her value to the crew. Scott was a methodical man who approached piracy with the same precision he'd once applied to legitimate merchant trading. He kept meticulous records of every prize taken, every expense incurred, and every crew member's share of their earnings. Most pirates are fools with money, Scott explained as Christine helped him catalog their latest haul of Spanish silver. They take a prize, divide it up, and spend it all in the first port they reach. That's why they die poor and desperate. We do things differently here. Christine's education in her father's business proved invaluable as she helped Scott negotiate with fence operations in various ports, identify valuable cargo that other pirates might overlook, and maintain the complex web of contacts that allowed the Crimson Tide to operate successfully in waters patrolled by multiple navies. The crew's attitude toward her began to shift as her competence became undeniable. She could splice rope as well as any sailor, read weather patterns to help them avoid storms or naval patrols, and had proved herself steady under pressure during 2 separate encounters with Spanish merchant vessels. It was during their 3rd month at sea that Christine first noticed George Jones watching her with something beyond professional assessment. She'd been working late in the chart room, updating their maps with new information about reef locations and safe harbors, when she became aware of his presence in the doorway. "You've adapted well," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "Better than I expected." Christine looked up from her work, noting the fatigue in his eyes. Being captain of a pirate vessel meant constant vigilance, endless decisions that could mean life or death for his crew, and the weight of responsibility that never lifted, even during the calmest seas. "I had good motivation," she replied, "and good teachers." George moved to stand beside her, studying the charts she'd been updating. His proximity made her acutely aware of his physical presence. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the scent of sea salt and leather that clung to his clothes. "You've marked new patrol routes for the Royal Navy," he observed, pointing to her notations. "How did you learn about these?" "I listened in the taverns while the crew was drinking. Merchant sailors talk freely when they think no one important is paying attention. A woman serving drinks becomes invisible to most men." George's mouth curved in what might have been approval. "Clever. That information could save our lives." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Christine explaining her updates while George shared his knowledge of wind patterns and seasonal changes that affected their routes. It was the longest conversation they'd had since she'd joined the crew, and Christine found herself studying his profile in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the careful way he considered every decision. "Why did you really take me on?" she asked suddenly. "You could have refused like every other captain." George was quiet for so long that Christine thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "Because you reminded me of someone I once knew. Someone who deserved a better chance than life gave her." Before Christine could ask what he meant, footsteps on the deck above announced the changing of the watch, and George straightened. The moment of openness closing like a door. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll reach Tortuga tomorrow, and there's always work to be done in port." The next morning brought their first real test as a crew when a lookout spotted 3 ships on the horizon flying British colors. George called all hands on deck, his voice carrying the authority that had kept his crew alive through countless encounters. "Naval patrol," he announced, lowering his spyglass. 3 ships, probably hunting us specifically. We can try to outrun them, but they've got the wind advantage." Scott Turner stepped forward. "What are our options, Captain?" George studied the approaching ships, calculating distances and wind patterns with the expertise of a man who'd survived by making such decisions quickly and correctly. "We can run for the shallows near Coral Key. They won't follow us into those waters with ships that size, but it means abandoning our planned rendezvous with the merchant vessel we've been tracking." The crew murmured among themselves, weighing the options. Christine found herself holding her breath, realizing that this decision would affect not just their immediate safety, but their entire mission. "There's another option," Christine said, her voice carrying clearly across the deck. Every eye turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. "The British ships are flying Admiral Morrison's colors. I recognize the flagship from Portsmouth. Morrison's known for his pride and his need to follow proper naval protocol." George's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "If we can make them think we're a legitimate merchant vessel in distress, Morrison will be required to render assistance. It would buy us time and get them close enough that we could disable their lead ship before they realize what's happening." The crew exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully, while others looked skeptical. Eric Long spoke up from his position near the mainmast. "That's a dangerous gamble, lass. If they see through the deception, we'll be trapped between 3 warships with nowhere to run. But if it works," Scott added, "we could capture or disable their flagship and escape before the other 2 can react effectively." George studied Christine with new intensity. "You're suggesting we use you as bait. A woman in distress would make the deception more convincing." Christine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting we use every advantage we have, including the fact that naval officers have certain assumptions about women that we can exploit." The silence stretched for several heartbeats while George weighed the risks. Finally, he nodded. "We try it, but if this goes wrong, the responsibility is mine, not yours." The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation as the crew transformed the Crimson Tide from a fearsome pirate vessel into a merchant ship in distress. Weapons were hidden but kept accessible. The black flag was replaced with British merchant colors, and Christine was provided with a torn dress and instructions to play the role of a passenger whose ship had been attacked by pirates. As the British ships approached, Christine positioned herself prominently on deck, waving a piece of white cloth in apparent desperation. George stood beside her, playing the role of a merchant captain grateful for rescue. The lead British ship, HMS Intrepid, came alongside with practiced precision. Admiral Morrison himself appeared at the rail, his uniform immaculate despite the sea spray and his bearing radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "What's your situation?" Morrison called across the water. George cupped his hands to his mouth. "Pirates attacked us 2 days ago. They took most of our cargo and left us with damaged rigging. This lady was a passenger on another vessel they sank. We pulled her from the water." Morrison's gaze fixed on Christine, taking in her disheveled appearance in apparent distress. "Bring your ship alongside. We'll take the lady aboard and provide what assistance we can." This was the crucial moment. If Morrison suspected deception, His guns would be trained on them within minutes. But Christine had read him correctly. His sense of duty and ingrained chivalry toward women in distress overrode his tactical caution. As the ships drew closer together, Christine caught George's eye and saw something there she hadn't expected. Concern, not just for the success of their plan, but for her personal safety. The realization sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, even as her heart pounded with the approaching danger. The boarding planks were secured between the ships, and Morrison himself crossed over to the Crimson Tide, accompanied by 6 Marines and his first officer. Christine forced tears into her eyes and stumbled toward him with convincing desperation. "Thank God you've come," she sobbed, allowing Morrison to steady her with a paternal hand on her arm. "The pirates, they killed everyone else. I thought I was going to die." Morrison's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "You're safe now, miss. We'll see you safely to Port Royal." Behind Morrison, his Marines were beginning to look around the ship with professional interest. Christine saw one of them notice the unusual cleanliness of the deck, another frowning at the quality of the rigging that seemed inconsistent with a merchant vessel that had supposedly been recently attacked. Time was running out. George caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. Christine took a shuddering breath and collapsed against Morrison, her apparent fainting spell bringing him close enough for George to press a pistol against his ribs, while the hidden crew members emerged from their concealment with weapons drawn. "Admiral Morrison," George said conversationally, "you're now my prisoner. Order your men to stand down, and no one needs to die today." Morrison's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he was too experienced an officer to let pride override the safety of his men. "Stand down," he ordered his Marines, his voice tight with controlled fury. The next few minutes were a carefully choreographed dance of surrender as Morrison's ships were forced to withdraw, while the Admiral remained hostage aboard the Crimson Tide. Christine found herself admiring George's handling of the situation. He treated Morrison with respect, provided comfortable quarters, and made it clear that the Admiral would be released unharmed once they reached safe waters. But it was later that evening, after Morrison had been secured in the guest cabin and the crew was celebrating their bloodless victory, that Christine realized how fundamentally the day had changed her relationship with George Jones. She was cleaning up in the galley when he appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "That was well done today," he said quietly. "Your plan saved lives on both sides." Christine set down the pot she'd been scrubbing and turned to face him. "I was terrified the entire time. What if Morrison had seen through the deception? What if his Marines had been more suspicious? But they weren't. You read the situation correctly and acted on it. That takes courage." There was something in his voice that made Christine look at him more closely. "You were worried about me." It wasn't a question, and George didn't try to deny it. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them. Heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to explore. Christine felt her pulse quicken as she realized that somewhere during their months at sea, her respect for George's leadership had deepened into something more personal and more dangerous. "George," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the complex emotions swirling through her. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough to notice the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Christine," he said, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "This life, this ship, it's not what you were meant for. You deserve better than to be running from naval patrols and living by your wits." Christine felt a flash of anger at his assumption. "Don't I get to decide what I deserve? Don't I get to choose my own life?" "Of course, but nothing." Christine stepped closer, eliminating the remaining distance between them. "I chose this life. I chose this ship, and I'm choosing to stay, regardless of what you think I deserve." George's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with surprising gentleness. "You don't understand what you're saying. This world, my world, it destroys everything good that enters it. Then maybe it's time for something good to change your world instead of being destroyed by it." The kiss that followed was inevitable, a collision of months of suppressed attraction and shared danger. Christine melted into George's embrace, her hands fisting in his shirt as she poured all her frustration and longing into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This complicates things," George said, his forehead resting against hers. "Everything about this life is complicated," Christine replied. "At least this complication is one we choose." Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened with the gradual inevitability of changing tides. George began spending evenings in Christine's company, sharing stories of his past and listening to her dreams for the future. She learned that he'd been born the son of a fisherman, pressed into naval service at 14, and had turned to piracy only after witnessing the corruption and cruelty of the officers he'd served under. "I never intended to become what I am," he told her one evening as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the sunset paint the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and crimson. "But sometimes life gives you choices between bad and worse, and you do what you must to survive." Christine understood that sentiment better than most. Her own transformation from merchant's daughter to pirate crew member had taught her that survival often required abandoning preconceived notions about who you were supposed to be. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The choices that brought you here?" George considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity of them, but I can't regret the results entirely. If I'd made different choices, I never would have met you." The words sent warmth spreading through Christine's chest. But they also carried an undertone of sadness that she was beginning to recognize in George's voice whenever he spoke about their future. It was Scott Turner who finally forced the issue into the open. The quartermaster approached Christine one morning while she was working on inventory, his expression more serious than usual. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, "about you and the captain." Christine set down her ledger, meeting Scott's gaze steadily. "What about us?" "The crew's noticed. They're starting to talk. Some think you're getting special treatment. Others worry about what happens if things go bad between you two. Either way, it's affecting morale." Christine felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd been so focused on her growing feelings for George that she hadn't considered how their relationship might impact the delicate balance of shipboard life. "What are you suggesting?" Scott leaned against the bulkhead, his expression thoughtful. "I'm suggesting you and the captain need to make a decision. Either you're crew members who happen to be involved, or you're something more that requires different arrangements." "Different arrangements?" "The captain's cabin is large enough for 2 people," Scott said bluntly. "If you're going to be together, do it properly. Stop sneaking around and pretending nothing's changed. The crew respects honesty, but they don't like being lied to." That evening, Christine sought out George in his cabin, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. She found him studying charts as usual, but he looked up immediately when she entered, as if he'd been expecting her. "Scott talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Christine closed the door behind her and leaned against it. "He says the crew is talking." George set down his compass and turned to face her fully. "They are, and they have every right to be concerned. A captain who's compromised by personal feelings puts the entire crew at risk." "Are you compromised?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple attraction or temporary infatuation. George stood and crossed to where she waited by the door. "Yes," he said simply, "completely and irrevocably compromised. The thought of anything happening to you terrifies me more than any naval patrol or rival pirate crew." Christine reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingertips. "Then we face that fear together. Move in here, with me. Stop pretending we're just captain and crew member when we're clearly something more." George caught her hand and pressed it flat against his cheek. "You understand what you're asking? If you move into this cabin, you become more than crew. You become my partner in every sense. The crew will look to you differently, expect different things from you." "What kind of things?" "Leadership, judgment, the ability to make hard decisions that affect everyone's survival. If something happens to me, they'll need to know they can trust you to help them through it." Christine felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of rightness. "I can handle that." "I know you can. That's what terrifies me." She laughed despite the seriousness of the conversation. "You're terrified that I'm capable?" "I'm terrified that you're too capable, that you'll outgrow this life, This ship, me, that one day you'll realize you could have anything you wanted and you'll leave. Christine stood on her toes and kissed him softly. George Jones, you brilliant, stubborn man. Don't you understand? I already have everything I want. The transition to sharing the captain's cabin was smoother than Christine had expected. The crew's reaction was largely positive, with several members expressing relief that the captain and his lady had finally stopped dancing around each other like nervous cats. Eric Long even went so far as to present Christine with a set of pistols that had belonged to his late wife. Every pirate's woman needs to know how to defend herself, he explained gruffly. These are good guns, well-maintained and accurate. Learn to use them properly. Christine spent the following weeks training with various crew members, learning not just marksmanship but sword work, knife fighting, and the brutal practicalities of close-quarters combat. George insisted on personally overseeing her weapons training, pushing her harder than she thought necessary until the day they encountered the Venganza. The Spanish pirate ship appeared out of a morning fog bank like a nightmare made manifest. Larger than the Crimson Tide and bristling with cannons, it flew the black flag of Captain Carlos Mendoza, a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout the Caribbean. He's been hunting us for months, George told Christine as the crew prepared for battle. We took a prize that he'd been tracking, and he considers it a personal insult. Christine checked her pistols and secured her sword, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. What does he want? Everything. Our ship, our treasure, our lives. Mendoza doesn't take prisoners, especially not from crews that have crossed him. The battle that followed was unlike anything Christine had experienced. The thunderous roar of cannons, the acrid smoke that burned her eyes and throat, the screams of wounded men, and the crash of falling rigging created a hellscape that tested every skill she'd learned over the past months. Christine found herself fighting alongside Eric Long as Spanish pirates boarded their ship, her pistols barking in her hands as she tried to protect the wounded cook from a sword-wielding enemy. The training George had insisted upon proved its worth as she moved with deadly efficiency, her blade finding its mark with precision born of countless hours of practice. But it was when she saw George surrounded by 3 Spanish pirates that Christine truly understood the depth of her transformation. Without conscious thought, she launched herself into the fray, her sword cutting down one attacker while her pistol accounted for another. The third man turned to face her, his blade raised, but George's cutlass took him in the back before he could strike. "Behind you!" Christine shouted, spinning to fire at another boarder who'd been creeping up on George's blind side. They fought back to back, protecting each other with the fluid coordination of partners who'd learned to anticipate each other's movements. When the smoke finally cleared and the surviving Spanish pirates retreated to their ship, Christine and George were still standing, bloodied but alive. "You saved my life," George said, pulling her into his arms despite the chaos around them. "You saved mine first," Christine replied, allowing herself a moment of weakness as the adrenaline faded and reaction set in. The victory over the Venganza marked another turning point in Christine's journey. The crew's respect for her fighting ability was now matched by their recognition of her tactical intelligence and her unwavering loyalty to their captain. She'd proven herself not just as George's partner, but as a valuable member of the crew in her own right. But it was in the quiet moments after the battle, as they tended to their wounded and repaired their ship, that Christine realized how completely her old life had fallen away. The frightened young woman who'd begged for work on the Portsmouth docks seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone harder, more confident, and infinitely more dangerous. "Do you miss it?" George asked one evening as they worked together to update their charts. "Your old life, the safety and predictability of it, got it?" Christine considered the question seriously. "I miss my father. I miss the certainty of knowing where I'd sleep each night and what each day would bring. But I don't miss the helplessness. I don't miss being dependent on other people's charity or goodwill. And you don't regret choosing this life? Choosing me?" Christine set down her pen and turned to face him fully. "George, I need you to understand something. I didn't choose this life as a desperate alternative to starvation. I chose it because it's where I belong. I chose you because you're who I want to be with, not because you're my only option." George's expression softened with something that might have been relief. I needed to hear that. I've been afraid that you were settling, that you'd eventually resent the limitations this life places on you. The only limitation I resent is the one that keeps us from visiting civilized ports where we could be married properly, Christine said, then blushed at her own boldness. George's eyes widened with surprise and something deeper. Is that what you want? Marriage? I want whatever makes this partnership official and permanent. Whether that's marriage in a church or handfasting on the deck of this ship, I want the world to know that we belong to each other. The wedding took place 3 days later, performed by Scott Turner in his capacity as ship's quartermaster and witnessed by the entire crew. Christine wore a dress of blue silk that George had purchased for her in their last port, and George wore his best uniform with his dress sword at his side. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted on the deck of the Crimson Tide as the sun set over calm Caribbean waters. Do you, Christine Ramos, take this man as your husband, to stand with him through calm seas and storms, through prosperity and hardship, until death parts you? Scott intoned. I do, Christine replied, her voice clear and strong. And do you, George Jones, take this woman as your wife, to protect and cherish her, to share with her your fortunes and your fate, until death parts you? I do, George said, his eyes never leaving Christine's face. Then by the authority vested in me by the articles of this ship and the laws of the sea, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Captain. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by cheers from the crew and the approving nods of men who'd seen too many relationships founder on the harsh realities of pirate life. But as Christine melted into George's embrace, she felt the rightness of the moment settle into her bones. That night, as they lay together in their cabin, listening to the gentle sounds of the ship at anchor, Christine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman begging for work on any ship that would take her. Now she was the wife of a pirate captain, a skilled fighter, and a valued member of a crew that had become her family. What are you thinking about? George asked, his arm tightening around her waist. How strange life is. How the worst thing that ever happened to me, losing my father and everything I thought I wanted, led me to the best thing that ever happened to me. George pressed a kiss to her shoulder. And what's that? Finding out who I really am. Finding you. Finding a place where I belong. The months that followed their marriage brought new challenges and deeper contentment. Christine's role on the ship evolved as she took on more responsibility for strategic planning and crew welfare. Her education and natural intelligence made her invaluable in negotiations with other pirate crews and in managing the complex web of alliances that kept them safe in increasingly dangerous waters. But it was her relationship with George that continued to surprise her with its depth and complexity. She'd expected passion and partnership, but she hadn't anticipated the quiet joy of shared daily routines, the comfort of having someone who understood her thoughts before she spoke them, or the fierce protectiveness that rose in her whenever he was threatened. Their first real test as a married couple came when they received word that Admiral Morrison, whom they'd captured and released months earlier, was leading a massive naval expedition specifically designed to hunt down the Crimson Tide. The British Navy had offered substantial rewards for information leading to their capture, and several of their usual safe harbors were no longer secure. We could run, George said as they studied reports from their network of informants. Head for the Pacific. Start over somewhere Morrison can't follow. Christine traced their possible routes on the chart, calculating distances and supply requirements. Or we could end this once and for all. George looked up sharply. What do you mean? Morrison's expedition is personal for him. We humiliated him, and he won't stop hunting us until he's restored his reputation. But what if we could turn his obsession against him? Christine outlined her plan with the same careful attention to detail she'd learned from Scott Turner. Morrison's fleet was large but unwieldy, dependent on supply ships and predictable in its patrol patterns. If they could lure him into a trap, separate his flagship from its support vessels, they could potentially capture or destroy the expedition's leadership and scatter the remaining ships. It's dangerous, George said when she'd finished. If we're wrong about any part of this, we'll be facing the entire British fleet with no escape route. But if we're right, we end the threat permanently and send a message to every other naval commander who might consider hunting us. George studied the charts for a long time, weighing risks and possibilities with the careful judgment that had kept his crew alive for years. Finally, he nodded. We'll need help. This isn't something we can do alone. The next weeks were spent in careful preparation and delicate negotiations. George reached out to other pirate captains, calling in old favors and forging new alliances. Christine found herself at the center of these discussions, her reputation for tactical intelligence having spread throughout the Caribbean pirate community. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope. 5 pirate ships would coordinate their efforts to lure Morrison's fleet into the treacherous waters around Devil's Triangle, where hidden reefs and unpredictable currents would neutralize the British advantage in firepower. Christine would once again play the role of bait, this time posing as a captured pirate captain's wife being transported to Port Royal for trial. "I don't like using you as bait again," George said as they made final preparations. "Too much can go wrong." Christine checked her hidden weapons and reviewed her cover story one more time. "Everything about this plan can go wrong. That's why it might work. Morrison expects us to run or fight conventionally. He won't expect us to walk into his trap and turn it inside out." The morning of the operation dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for the complex naval maneuvers they'd planned. Christine took her position aboard a captured merchant vessel, playing the role of a dejected prisoner, while George commanded the Crimson Tide from a distance, ready to spring the trap when Morrison took the bait. The British fleet appeared on schedule, Morrison's flagship leading the formation with the same rigid precision that had made him a successful naval commander. Christine forced herself to remain calm as the HMS Intrepid approached, knowing that her performance in the next hour would determine whether their plan succeeded or ended in disaster. Morrison himself came aboard the merchant vessel to inspect his prize, his face lighting with satisfaction when he saw Christine in chains. "Mrs. Jones, I presume, your husband has led us quite a chase, but it ends today." Christine allowed despair to show in her expression, playing the role of a broken woman whose spirit had been crushed by capture. "He'll come for me. George always comes for me." "I'm counting on it," Morrison replied coldly. "Your husband's weakness for you will finally be his undoing." But Morrison had underestimated both George's tactical brilliance and Christine's own capabilities. As the British fleet moved into position to spring what they believed was their trap, the coordinated pirate attack began. Ships emerged from hidden coves and concealed positions, their guns already trained on the British vessels. Christine waited until Morrison's attention was focused on the battle developing around them before making her move. The chains that bound her were fake, designed to fall away at the right moment, and the hidden knife in her boot found its way into her hand with practiced ease. "Admiral Morrison," she said conversationally, pressing the blade against his throat as his Marines turned in shock, "I believe you are now my prisoner." The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Caught between multiple enemies in treacherous waters, the British fleet found itself outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Morrison's capture demoralized his crews, and when the smoke cleared, 3 British warships had surrendered, while the others fled in disarray. George's face when he boarded the merchant vessel and saw Christine holding Morrison at knife point was a mixture of relief, pride, and exasperation. "You were supposed to wait for rescue, Guamit," he said, though his tone held more admiration than reproach. "I got tired of waiting," Christine replied, transferring her prisoner to George's custody with professional efficiency. "Besides, I thought you might appreciate the symmetry." The victory over Morrison's fleet marked the end of their most serious threat and the beginning of a new phase in their relationship with the British Navy. Word spread quickly that the pirate captain George Jones and his formidable wife were not to be underestimated, and other naval commanders became much more cautious about pursuing them. But for Christine, the real victory was personal. Standing on the deck of the Crimson Tide, watching the defeated British ships disappear over the horizon, she felt the final pieces of her transformation click into place. She was no longer the desperate young woman who'd begged for work on the Portsmouth docks. She was Christine Jones, pirate captain's wife, tactical genius, and formidable warrior in her own right. "What are you thinking about?" George asked, joining her at the rail as the crew celebrated their victory. I was remembering something you said to me that first night when I told you I'd sleep on deck if you'd just give me work. George smiled, wrapping his arms around her from behind. I told you that you'd sleep next to me in my cabin, where you'd be safe. You did, and I thought you were just another man trying to take advantage of a desperate woman. I never imagined you were offering me a partnership that would change everything about who I am. Do you regret the changes? Christine leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him and the gentle motion of their ship beneath her feet. I regret nothing. Not the hardships, not the dangers, not the choices that brought me here. This is who I was meant to be, George. This is where I belong. As the sun set over the Caribbean waters, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Christine reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment. She'd sought work and found purpose. She'd hoped for survival and discovered love. She'd begun as a passenger and become a captain in her own right. The woman who'd once said she'd sleep on deck for the chance to work had found something far more valuable than employment. She'd found herself, her strength, and her place in a world that had initially seemed hostile and unforgiving. In George's arms, on the deck of their ship, surrounded by a crew that had become her family, Christine Jones was exactly where she belonged. The future stretched before them, uncertain as the sea itself, but bright with possibility. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, partners in every sense of the word, their love forged in the crucible of shared danger and tempered by mutual respect and understanding. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Christine smiled and closed her eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of their ship and crew. She'd found her home at last, not in any port or harbor, but in the life she'd built with her own hands and the love she'd discovered in the most unexpected place. The desperate woman who'd once begged for passage was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more complete.